Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Cadence Independent Media Production. Today we are talking about not just myths or tips or hacks, but actually kind of a fundamental thing about drums, and it's why it is that the further you get away from your drum set, the worse it sounds, and things we should be thinking about if we want to project the sound that we're hearing at the kit over to the audience a little better. The drum set is many instruments crammed together. It looks like one instrument, but it's really a bunch of discrete things. I think this is, fairly obvious when you start taking the pieces away and looking at them. And the thing about sound is that every single one of these things is throwing sound mainly in one direction and then a little bit in some other directions. Thanks so much to Synced for sponsoring this week's episode of Sounds Like a Drum. Synced is an iOS app that we've previewed in the past that's a super advanced metronomic and sort of practice beat making piece of software that we use a lot around here. We all have it, and it's really given us a lot of great tools to work on complex rhythms and also to work on shifting time signatures. I really like it for that. Today we want to highlight this particular feature, which is the drag and drop, which is made possible by the touchscreen and allows you to move beats, bars, rests, any part of it around super easily if you want to be adjusting the rhythms as you go and maybe modifying the grid in different ways that you're practicing to. The first thing I want to talk about is, what is projection anyway? Well, it's how is the sound getting to the person that's listening to it? Is it you right here? Is it somebody 20 feet away? And who are we doing it for? And how do we get the sound to the person or the microphone or whatever that's supposed to hear it? The physics that we're dealing with here. All of these cylinders with membranes on them are kind of pointed in different directions. The kick is pointed this way, the toms are kind of pointed at the ceiling, the snare is kind of pointed at my face, and the sort of business direction of the drum is in the direction that the heads are throwing the sound, more so than the shell. There is lateral sound coming out of the shell, we'll talk about that later, but then you have the bass drum that's actually usually kind of pointed directly at the audience, which they're all different, and they're all creating different frequency ranges too, which have different capacities to traverse distance and still sound basically the same. So each one of these has to be treated slightly differently, but there are some fundamental things that we need to talk about in order to make sure that, especially in minimally or unmiked situations, we're not enjoying a beautiful sound while the audience is wondering where all the tone is at. Now, an acronym that I wasn't really privy to till we started doing this show is what they call jaw tuning, or just above a wrinkle tuning. And this is much more common than I thought as sort of an axiom for tuning, particularly bass drums and toms, and snares less so. I mean, they tend to be pitched higher. And just above a wrinkle essentially means that you're tuning the drum right above where you see wrinkles in the head, or possibly, depending on who you talk to, if you press in the center of the head and see wrinkles. That in general speaks to a very low tuning for basically everything. And what we're going to run into with that kind of tension is not a lot of projection of tone, a fairly large amount of projection of attack, which is good, but the actual tone of the drum's not going so far. Now, I haven't done a ton of research into the sort of invention of this as an axiom for tuning, but I do understand the physics behind what it's doing and why there's more attack, and also why it doesn't throw the tone so well, laterally in particular. And that's simply because there's not enough tension on the heads to activate the shell and get the whole thing to work as a unit to make the fundamental. Now, before we get into the actual sounds that we're making with this type of tuning, it's worth mentioning that we went ahead and close mic'd everything. We also have a 414 behind me, there's a room mic, and as we go through this demonstration, you're going to see highlighted on the screen which mics are activated right now so that you'll understand which mics are receiving what part of the sound. All right, so depending on which mics we engage, this sounds really great, but as you can hear from the room mic, and to a lesser degree the 414, which is behind my head, more of like drummer perspective, as soon as you get away from the kit, the tone starts to go away, but we still have plenty of attack. Now in a studio situation, utilizing close mics for tone and far mics for attack is totally reasonable. That's a thing that we do. If you're in a situation playing live unmiked or with minimal miking, which oftentimes maybe is just the kick and the snare and nothing else, this will be problematic because the engineer will be turning on the snare mic and the kick mic, and then when you go to your toms, they go away, and all of that beautiful work you did, I mean, no one's going to hear it. Now, thing two about this, which isn't a big deal for everyone, but it's a big deal for me and some players that are less about articulation at a single dynamic and who like a lot of different levels of dynamic to project from the toms, is that when you get down quiet with this kind of tuning, all of the life of the toms go away because there's just not enough energy to activate anything in them when you lower it down. Now, we didn't talk about the snare drum yet, but I went ahead and pitched the snare very high because I'm accustomed these days to hearing, in general, pretty low toms, pretty low bass drum, and a surprisingly high snare sound. Now, the high snare sound does project. It cuts like crazy. But I wanted to bring it into this moment to show you that when you get down into lower dynamics, there's not a lot of fatness in the drum. There's not a lot of tone projecting. There's that beautiful attack, and since it's tuned super high, that's coming at you. But check this out. I'm going to do a little sort of dynamic sweep from quiet to loud on these drums the way they are now, and watch how they sort of start dead, they open up, and then they kind of self-compress as it gets really loud. So as you can see, with this kind of tuning, there's sort of a happy dynamic, which is in the aggressive range of hitting the drums. The snare is a little more dynamic, but the toms kind of become happy as you start to really get into them, which is great, again, for lots of situations. This isn't about right and wrong. This is just about knowing what's going to happen when you make these kinds of choices. Lastly, the bass drum actually is totally fine down like this. It works. It feels good, especially to bury the beater. For me, there's actually not a whole lot of tone where I'm sitting from the bass drum, which I would like a little bit more of. So what we're going to do now is we're basically going to pitch the toms and the bass drum up, and we're going to lower the batter on the snare a little bit and bring it into an area where hitting it harder makes it open up just a little bit. And conversely, the tones will open up in the toms a little bit more at lower dynamics and ultimately land in all of the microphones better. I'm also going to pitch the bass drum batter up just a little bit, but I'm going to use my ear for this. I'm using my ear for all of it, but particularly with the bass drum, just a little bit to where when I hit it, I start to feel some pushback from the low end of it. It's a very small amount, like maybe not even half a turn on the whole thing. And the toms leaving the resos alone, snare leaving the resos alone. listening to what the different mics are receiving, we're starting to realize now that the room mic is getting some tone from these toms. The AKG behind me is also getting more tone from them than it was before. I'm getting more punch out of the bass drum. I'm in the minority with bass drums where I generally pitch the batter higher than the reso. I use the reso to decide how much tone it has, and I use the batter just for feel or maybe for pitch on anything from an 18 all the way up to a 24 or 26. That's just a personal thing, but that's what's going on here. The batter is higher than the reso in that case, and the rest it's the other way around. With the snare, there's a little more snare wire sound, particularly in the room mic, and maybe a little less attack. It's perceived as being a little bit less loud, but in the overall scheme of things, I feel like everything is speaking together a little bit better. Now, Ben mentioned something important about this business with the toms that people bring up sometimes with the idea of pitching them up, and we didn't pitch them up much. It was a very small amount. I mean, definitely less than half a turn, or maybe only a quarter. The idea that you're going to lose your low end as you go higher. Now, the nature of the low end where I'm sitting is different than it was before, which is to say it's immediately after the attack. You hit it and the tone is present immediately, versus the super low tuning where you hear the attack and then a sort of lift of low end afterward. For me, this kind of tuning took a little while to get used to when I was younger because I'm used to recordings. I'm used to the sound of recorded drums from listening to records. And an awful lot of the time, those drums might be tuned that way. They might be tuned this way. But this sound is where I landed when I thought to myself, I'm playing shows that are not mic'd. I'm playing small clubs or I'm playing restaurant gigs, things like that. And I'm also playing at lower volumes. Now, we're going to do a quick run through again, quiet to loud, so you can hear how these behave at a lower volume. But even for, folk music or jazz guys who, a lot of them tune their drums pretty high, I find that when I ask them why they do that, it's because of articulation at lower dynamics and overall being able to use the whole range of the drum. So let's check out the range of these now. Okay, so now there's an immediacy of tone through the whole dynamic range. If we pitched them up a little more, it might be even better at the most extremely quiet dynamics, but we're activating the shell now, and there's a kind of low end that the shell helps you make that goes farther than the low end that a couple of very thin sheets of plastic or animal skin, if you use those, can do. They just can't do it. At the end of the day, we're basically working with or fighting the physics of sound when we're trying to figure out where we need this sound to go. And the only thing you can really do is work with that because these are kind of immutable laws of nature, and if you're dealing with making certain kinds of sounds and you're recording, you can kind of get away with whatever you want. But particularly in live situations, these things can be your friend, but you might have to experiment a little bit and go into tuning realms that aren't what you think you're supposed to do. Supposed, the worst word ever. Or they might be things that will surprise you and go, oh, that's where that sound is at that I was looking for in the first place. I mean, the first time I heard that Tony Williams used to have the bottom heads fall off of his toms when they were traveling because the bottoms were so loose, that's insane. Like the tops being super tight and the bottoms so loose that they fall out in the case in the van or whatever. Like that's crazy. But if it's the right sound, you do whatever you got to do. So that about wraps it up for this particular experiment. I'm looking forward to doing a bit more of a deep dive into the concept of mixing from the drum throne and trying to play your instruments based on how loud they are in the collective mix of this sort of like baby orchestra that we have here. And we'll get into that later because tuning comes into that too. But this is a huge part of that idea of making sure that the collective sound that you're making is getting presented to the audience the way that you want it, and that each drum is making it to the listener or the microphone in the way that you think it is based on what you're hearing where you're sitting. It's a big endeavor to really understand, but at the end of the day, it's so worth it. And I mean, we have to do it. Thanks so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the little notification button below so that you can get the notifications for our new videos. We are releasing season 3 now. We're super psyched about it, and have a lot of really exciting things in the hopper that we're going to be bringing out. Thank you again to all of our patrons for helping us make this season possible. This is a Patreon-funded season, and your support is what's making this possible. If you have not yet been over there to check it out, follow the link below and contribute if you can. Check out the perks, check out the levels, all that stuff. We're excited about it, and we're really thrilled to be able to interact with the community directly in this way and have you influence what we're doing here. It's super awesome. Lastly, tell me about your tom tuning and how you got there, and particularly if you used to do it one way and now you do it a different way, because that was my experience. I've been through several phases of this is the right way, and where you end up is there is no right way. You just do whatever works for the gig that you're doing. But yeah, let us know, and I'll look forward to that.